Welcome to the deep dive. You've sent us your sources, and, well, we're here to unpack them. Find those key insights, the stuff that really, sticks.
Exactly.
Today we're digging into this really fascinating piece of research you shared. It looks at how owning assets actually influences what we think and how we act.
Yeah, it's based on a study evaluating a social policy idea, and it uses some really compelling long-term data.
It really gets to the heart of this question. How does having stuff, owning things, shape your attitudes, your behaviors?
It does. We usually think about assets just in terms of money, right?
Yeah.
Financial security. But this research hints it might be much, much broader than that.
Okay, so let's maybe set the stage a bit first. The paper kicks off with some historical context, which is quite revealing. It mentions President Clinton's 1994 welfare reform proposal.
Right, the one that included individual development accounts, IDAs.
Yeah, IDAs. And the core idea there was encouraging people to actually build up assets.
And what's really interesting, the paper notes, is the bipartisan support this got. It was seen as like a totally new angle on tackling poverty.
A fresh approach, yeah.
Focusing on empowering people through ownership, not just relying solely on safety nets for, consumption.
Right, and the paper connects this way back even to thinkers like Thomas Jefferson and his whole emphasis on property ownership. It seems like there's this long-standing belief that having assets does more than just secure your finances.
It suggests it also boosts your well-being, maybe your social standing, even how involved you are as a citizen.
Like the Homestead Act, maybe. Giving out land and asset with this idea of shaping society.
Exactly, that's a great example. The underlying belief is that holding assets fosters a kind of investment in the future.
A sense of security.
Security, empowerment, yeah. And that can ripple outwards. The focus really shifted from just welfare to promoting asset building.
Okay, so that's the historical and policy backdrop. Asset building is the focus. But before the specific study, what did we actually know about how our economic situation, and especially owning assets, influenced our thoughts and actions?
Yeah, that's the crucial context. The paper goes into earlier research, mostly stuff from before 1972.
Okay.
And that research looked into connections between economic status and things like efficacy.
Efficacy, meaning like your belief in your own ability to succeed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That plus trust in others, your aspirations, ambitions, how much risk you're willing to take, even how connected you feel to your community.
And behaviors, too.
Yeah, and behaviors like being in the workforce, income levels, things like that.
Sounds like they were wrestling with that classic chicken and egg problem, right?
Totally.
Does more income lead to better attitudes, or did the attitudes help you earn more?
Precisely. Researchers back then saw how complex it was. They found links between sort of internal attitudes, your sense of control, and also external stuff related to your job, like your pay, what kind of work you did.
But the paper points out a gap.
A significant gap, yeah. A lot of that early work looked at broader economic status, mostly income. It didn't really zero in on the specific effects of owning assets on those attitudes and behaviors.
Okay, so the link between money and mindset was being explored, but the unique impact of owning stuff wasn't crystal clear, which leads us to the research that tried to make that direct connection, assets to social and the psychological stuff. What did that show?
Well, interestingly, there was some cross-cultural research hinting at links between property ownership and various social or psychological outcomes, like think anthropological studies in different societies.
Right, observational stuff.
Exactly. But as the paper notes, a lot of those were more observational, maybe limited in terms of really rigorous testing or proving clear cause and effect.
Less about controlled experiments, more spotting patterns.
Yeah. And then more modern research started looking at like power dynamics related to assets, especially for wealthier groups. But the real shift, the paper suggests, came with trying to study these connections more systematically across more diverse groups of people.
Getting more rigorous.
Right. The paper mentions a 1990 study by Zolcinski. It found a link between owning a home and things like self-directedness, intellectual flexibility, specifically among auto workers.
Huh. So just owning your house seemed tied to how you thought, how independent you felt?
Seems like it. And then there was Valsler and Page Adams in 93. They found a connection between property ownership and lower depression rates.
Lower depression, wow.
Yeah, and also higher self-esteem, particularly when people were going through big life changes. It kind of suggests assets might offer a sort of psychological buffer,
Stability.
a safety net. Makes sense. Then the paper brings up Sheridan's 1991 proposal. Sounds like he had a big theory about how assets could lead to these positive things. He did. Sheridan basically proposed that having assets could kick off this whole chain reaction of positive effects.
Like what?
Like more stability for the household because you have something to fall back on, a more long-term outlook because you're literally invested in the future.
Right.
Maybe increased effort because you have something to build and protect. Even enhance human capital, like maybe you're more willing to invest in training if you feel secure.
Okay, yeah.
And even potentially greater political participation, feeling like you have more of a stake in how things run.
It all hangs together logically, but like the paper says, proving that direct A causes B link was tough. Mostly because they didn't have good longitudinal data back then.
Exactly. Information from the same people over a long time. Which is precisely why the panel study of income dynamics, the PSID, is so critical here. The paper really highlights its value. Can you tell us about the PSID?
Absolutely. The PSID is this really amazing data set. It started way back in 1968, surveying over 5,000 families.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and the key thing is they followed these same families for years and years, collecting tons of data. Now, the specific study we're diving into uses data from the first 5 years, 68 to 72.
And that's the longitudinal part, right, following the same people.
Exactly, which is much, much better for trying to figure out cause and effect than just taking a snapshot at one point in time.
Right. So what was special about that early PSID data for this research?
Well, it gave them this unique chance to see how people's assets, things like their house value, their savings, their income back in 1968, might have influenced their attitudes and behaviors over the next 5 years.
Okay, so looking forward in time.
Yeah. They looked at attitudes like prudence, that efficacy thing, again, belief in yourself, their future outlook, which they called horizons, how connected they felt, and their level of effort.
So not just a one-time picture. They were tracking if your starting assets could predict changes in how you thought and acted down the line.
Correct. And they used statistical models trying to account for other things, too, like age, race, gender, education, whether there were young kids around.
Controlling for those other factors. Makes sense. Trying to isolate the potential impact of the assets themselves. So what did they find? What were the results?
Well, the big takeaway is that those initial asset levels did seem to have a noticeable effect on how attitudes and behaviors changed over those 5 years, though the researchers are careful to call the effects modest.
Okay, so significant, but not, like, earth-shattering.
Right. Specifically, having a higher home value back in 68 predicted increases in prudence, efficacy, and having a longer-term outlook by 72.
So owning a home seemed linked to better planning and more self-belief.
That's what it suggests. It seems to foster that belief in your ability to succeed and plan ahead.
Interesting. What about savings? Did that show anything?
Yeah, higher initial savings were linked to increases in efficacy again, but also feeling more connected to others and putting in more effort.
So savings also tied to efficacy, but maybe more towards engagement and effort.
Seems like it. Income also showed some positive links, but maybe not quite as consistently across the board as home value or savings.
Okay, but what's really fascinating, didn't the study also hint at a two-way street?
Yes, that's a key point, a reciprocal relationship. It wasn't just assets influencing attitudes and behaviors.
It also looked like the attitudes and behaviors could then influence how much people were able to save or build up in assets later on.
Exactly. It's like a dynamic system. These things probably feed off each other over time.
They reinforce each other.
And the study even suggested that maybe some of the positive effects we usually attribute to higher income might actually be happening because income lets you build assets.
So the assets themselves could be a key part of how income makes a difference.
Potentially, yeah. Like assets are the crucial mechanism, the missing link. That's a pretty powerful idea.
It really is. And that has some pretty significant implications, especially for policy, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, if earning assets really can foster that longer-term view, boost confidence, encourage engagement, well, it definitely strengthens the argument for policies designed to help people build assets.
Especially for people who have historically found it hard to get a foothold in ownership.
Right. But we should also remember what the paper emphasized assets aren't, a magic bullet.
No, definitely not. The effects were modest, remember, which means lots of other things in a person's life and their environment are clearly really important too.
Very true. And the study itself had limitations, right? Like the time frame.
Yeah, 5 years is valuable for that era's longitudinal research, but it's still pretty short to see the full long-term impact of owning something like a house.
Right, that takes decades sometimes. And teasing apart the specific effects of different assets, a house versus savings versus maybe stocks, that's also really complex.
For sure. So it clearly points towards needing more research, right? Following people for even longer, using maybe more nuanced ways to measure both the assets and all those social and psychological factors?
Absolutely. This study gives us some really compelling early evidence. It supports the idea that assets do more than just sit in a bank account. They can have these broader positive effects. But yeah, it also just opens up so many more questions for future investigation.
Okay, so let's try and bring it all together. This deep dive into the research you sent suggests there's solid evidence that owning assets seems to have a real positive influence on some key attitudes and behaviors. Maybe not overwhelmingly strong, but definitely there.
Yeah, it backs up the idea that helping people build assets could be a really valuable tool, for promoting individual well-being, maybe creating a more engaged society.
But it's clearly not a simple fix-all, and there's still a lot we need to figure out.
Exactly, which kind of leads to a final thought maybe for our listeners to chew on. If we take these findings seriously, what are the best ways to actually encourage and support asset building, for different kinds of people in different communities? And what kind of unexpected ripple effects, positive or maybe even negative, could those efforts have on society down the road? It's definitely something worth thinking more about.